We are blessed today with music. We who must now continue to wrestle with the growing reality of economic injustice in America. We who are challenged to face the fact that this nation has no humane future if it does not deal with the rehumanizing of its cities. We who remember King's unceasing warnings about the triple American evils of racism, militarism, and materialism are engaged and assisted much more fully by the Martin King of the post-1963 years than by an earlier, more convenient hero. My hope is that we might press ourselves beyond amnesia and engage the tougher, more difficult Martin King. As with Malcolm, one of King's most significant characteristics in his last years was his willingness to take great risks on behalf of hope, to shake himself free of the more familiar triumphant settings and break loose toward the solitary unchartedness of the wilderness, especially if that exploratory movement might help him to respond more faithfully to the cries of the poor, the vulnerable, the marginalized women, men, and children of our nation and our world. Perhaps the memory of Martin King needs to be broken free from all official attempts to manage, market, and domesticate him. At this time, we need a truly free and inconvenient hero, one who may help us to explore new dimensions of our freedom, not simply as a private agenda, but to follow his unmanageable style of seeking and using freedom to serve the needs of the most vulnerable, the most unfree among us. My concern here is that we stop holding King captive to his most pliant history in order that he might help us break free toward our most creative future as persons, as communities, as a nation. How else will we be worthy of such a magnificently inconvenient hero? How else will we discover the hero within us all? Those are not my words. They come from a remarkable little book by Dr. Vincent Harding. And the central tenet of that book is that the Martin King of our popular culture, the one most people are going to march for tomorrow, the one most often quoted, is a relatively easy and convenient Martin Luther King. The tendency, he writes, is to remember and celebrate the I Have a Dream speech of 1963. And how could we forget those words, the moral authority of that moment, the passion, not to mention an exquisite sense of timing and cadence and inflection, have inspired 2 generations of activists and remain some of the most often quoted words of the 20th century. But Harding's point is that the I Have a Dream Martin Luther King was a Martin Luther King still very much in transition. A man privately wrestling with even bigger questions, a man troubled by a growing sense that racial equality was only the beginning. My hope this morning is to explore a little of this more difficult Martin Luther King after I Have a Dream. And I hope to shed a little light on why the civil rights leader of 1963 made many people uncomfortable, but it was his later growth and activities toward economic and foreign policy activism that was much more frightening to the American establishment. I also hope to explore the Christian faith of Martin Luther King that fueled and sustained him from start to finish. You might remember, if you lived through that time, or if you've read some history, that it was only a few weeks after 1963, I Have a Dream, that the bomb went off in the 16th Street Baptist Church, killing 4 little girls. It was only a year and a half after I Have a Dream that the first march in Selma, Alabama was turned back by attack dogs and water hoses. 70 marchers were hospitalized, 2 were killed. It was in this period that King began to publicly ask deeper questions, questions that got him in trouble not only with the authorities but with other black leaders. He'd begun to articulate the connection between violence and poverty, a connection that we as a country still have not really wrestled with. He'd begun to articulate the unintended consequences of a materialist ethic and culture, and how a focus on material things and acquisitions would inevitably devalue human beings and institutionalize poverty for people of all races. He'd begun to articulate that this would mean questioning some of the fundamental assumptions that underlie our entire society, questions about capitalism and power and opportunity and privilege, and how these abstractions are lived out in policies both explicit and deeply hidden. He had begun to reshape the movement beyond racial equality to a much broader and more inclusive justice. He began to speak out not just for civil rights, but about foreign policy. He spoke out strongly against the Vietnam War. He called attention to our secret agendas and practices in Central America and our tacit approval of apartheid in South Africa. He spoke out about the economic investment in places like Asia, Africa, and South America, investments which inevitably aligned the powerful of the United States with the torturously violent and often oppressive regimes of those regions. He spoke out against the power of the military-industrial complex, swallowing up unbelievably vast amounts of money and resources while millions lived in slums and ghettos. Listen to the Martin Luther King of 1967. I want to say to you as I move to my conclusion, as we talk about where do we go from here, that we must honestly face the fact that the movement must address itself to the question of restructuring the whole of American society. There are 40 million poor people here, and one day we must ask the question, why are there 40 million poor people in America? And when you began to ask that question, you're raising a question about the economic system, about a broader distribution of wealth. And when you ask that question, you begin to question the capitalistic economy. And I'm simply saying that more and more we've got to begin to ask questions about the whole society. We're called upon to help the discouraged beggars in life marketplace, but one day we must come to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring. I'm not talking about communism. What I'm saying to you this morning is communism forgets that life is individual. Capitalism forgets that life is social. And the kingdom of brotherhood is found neither in the thesis of communism nor the antithesis of capitalism, but in a higher synthesis. It is found in a higher synthesis that combines the truths of both. Now, when I say questioning the whole of society, it means ultimately coming to see that the problem of racism, the problem of economic exploitation, and the problem of war are all tied together. These are the triple evils that are interrelated. By this time, in 67, 68, by this time, King was under criticism from almost everywhere. The mainstream media was regularly calling him a communist and a traitor. He made an enemy of Lyndon Johnson for his criticism of the war. He was accused of harming his own people by speaking to issues outside of his concern. He even lost the support of other black civil rights leaders who saw in his attention to these broader issues a betrayal of the cause of racial equality. The trouble was that he was serious. The 1963 dream of racial equality had expanded to the hard work of economic justice for all people. In 1967, he conceived and initiated the Poor People's Campaign, hoping to organize all walks of American life to raise consciousness and affect public policy. As we consider this legacy, it seems important, to me at least, that we understand the faith and the spiritual beliefs of this complicated man. Legend has it that Martin King carried 2 well-worn and battered books with him wherever he went. One of them was Civil Disobedience by Henry David Thoreau. And the other was a book called Jesus and the Disinherited by Howard Thurman. And that is a book I highly recommend to you, actually. It sounds like it's going to be about theology. It's actually some astonishingly poignant and deep advice on how to live a good life. Jesus and the Disinherited, Howard Thurman. The Jesus of Howard Thurman and the Jesus of Martin Luther King, though, is Jesus as religious leader and teacher. Religious leader and teacher, not as religious object. And I invite you to consider that subtle but very important distinction. To see Jesus as a religious leader and teacher rather than as a religious object is to focus on his words and their deeds in their original context rather than on all the theology that has dominated Christianity for so many centuries. And when you do that, when you consider the words and the teachings of Jesus in their original context, everything you think you know about Jesus and Christianity will change. Thurman begins with the observation that Jesus was first and foremost a Jew. His homeland occupied by a foreign army, his people having few civil rights, almost no protection under the law, and Jesus was a poor Jew, almost certainly illiterate. Thurman understands that when Jesus speaks in the gospel, he is not thinking about white people in 20th century America. Right? That's not in his mind. Right? He is speaking to his fellow Jews, also poor, oppressed by Romans, heavily taxed, at the whim pretty much of any passing soldier. He is speaking to people whose situation is somewhat similar to what people of color have lived through for most of American history. And if you study the teachings in this context, again, everything you think you know about Jesus and Christianity gets turned on its head. Thurman wrote, Jesus recognized with authentic realism that anyone who permits another to determine the quality of their inner life gives into the hands of the other the keys to their destiny. Now, I did not grow up in a traditional Christian church, but my understanding is that that is not an interpretation of Jesus you are likely to find in a typical Lutheran, Presbyterian, Baptist, Episcopalian, or Catholic church. But this is precisely the way Martin King interprets the teachings of Jesus. It's precisely this faith that King brings to his life's work. And I just want to come back to that a minute. Jesus recognized that anyone who permits another to determine the quality of their inner life gives into the hands of the other the keys to their destiny. And you might see that as kind of a political statement, but I invite you to see that as a spiritual statement, and I invite you to consider that not just in the context of political parties, but in the context of a culture, right, that subtly and obviously keeps us all mired in materialism. Here's a passage from 1967 where King is using the Bible to make his central point. One night, a juror came to Jesus and wanted to know what he could do to be saved. Jesus didn't get bogged down on the kind of isolated approach that you shouldn't do. Jesus didn't say, now, Nicodemus, you must stop lying. He didn't say, now, Nicodemus, you must not commit adultery. He didn't say, now, Nicodemus, you must stop cheating if you're doing that. He didn't say, Nicodemus, you must stop drinking liquor if you're doing that excessively. He said something different because Jesus realized something basic. That if a man will lie, he will steal. And if a man will steal, he will kill. So instead of just getting bogged down on one thing, Jesus looked at him and said, Nicodemus, you must be born again. In other words, your whole structure must be changed. A nation that will keep people in slavery for 244 years will thingify them and make them things. And therefore they will exploit them and poor people generally economically. And a nation that will exploit economically will have to have foreign investments and everything else. It will have to use its military might to protect them. All of these problems are tied together. What I'm saying today is we must go forth from this convention and say, America, you must be born again. But I invite you to notice how the focus when King is preaching is on what Jesus said and did, and not on who Jesus was or might have been. Notice that the interpretation is multi-leveled. The message speaks to the spirit of the individual seeker, but it also speaks to the social and political arena. Martin King, informed by Jesus, is telling us that the internal realities of our spirits and the external realities of politics and culture cannot be compartmentalized or separated. They are inextricably woven in every heart and soul. The spiritual is the political, and politics is always spiritual. The Christian faith of Martin Luther King was a justification for tearing down the structures of authority. The exact opposite of how Christianity has been used for about 1,700 years. And underneath this is the more central teaching of Jesus, which is God's abiding love, not just for a select few, but for everyone, all of God's creatures, no exceptions. King says to us, the goal is brotherhood. And there can be no authentic brotherhood without justice. What Martin Luther King came to in the last years of his life is that the single largest injustice of our world is represented by the huge gap between the haves and the have-nots. He recognized that it is this very system, and not just the political and economic system, but the thought and belief system which creates and sustains the economic and political system. That is what creates and perpetuates a vast underclass of poverty-stricken people, incongruously surrounded by the greatest material wealth the world has ever seen. By the end of his life at 39, the dream of 1963 had grown deeper and wider. It had become a dream not just of mainstreaming, but of forging a whole new river. And if he knew what that new river looked like, from having been to the mountaintop he refers to in the last sermon of his life, he did not share the details of its construction. That remains an inconvenient question for us. Despite the tragic end, the faith of Martin Luther King was one of great hope. He believed in the cause. He believed it was the right and faithful thing to do, even in the face of tremendous odds. Even in the face of the very real threat of violence and the high probability of failure. Even failure, King heard from Jesus, does not let us off the hook. In this way, both Jesus and Martin Luther King leave us with an inconvenient legacy. Where do we go from here? Don Marquis posed the question poetically like this. He said, "What shall have ultimate dominion? Shall it be dream, or shall it be dust?" I believe that to be a people of faith, a community of faith, means that we choose the dream and we put our faith to work. Amen.